It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from London, Nico Hines, world editor of said publication. How are you?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to England-France at the World Cup tomorrow.
You are? Okay.
Good luck to our French viewers.
Oh, well, I'll say the same to all our viewers from across the channel. Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. Viv, got to say, a little disappointed that Kylian Mbappe wasn't named Time's Person of the Year.
Oh, I know. What a shocker.
All right. Also joining us, Borzu Dargai, international correspondent for The Independent. How are things?
Great.
Great.
Yeah, except for this weather.
Except for the weather. We won't mention football. Swiss journalist Joseph de Weck, author of Macron, the Revolutionary President. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
All right. You can listen, by the way, like and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. During the Cold War, the exchanges would happen at Berlin's Bridge of Spies. In a flashback moment staged this time in Abu Dhabi, U.S. basketball star Brittney Griner swapped for Russian arms trafficker Viktor Bout. The former stopped on the eve of the war in Ukraine in February with cannabis resin in her suitcase at Moscow airport. The latter serving a 25-year sentence in the U.S. for selling arms to rebels and rogue states the world over. What was your reaction when you looked at those images for the first time, Borzu?
I mean, I thought it was a pretty good deal. I mean, it's Viktor Bout, the merchant of death, the subject of many stories in the arms trafficking world. He had done 14 years. It's not like he was being let off on no punishment for his many transgressions and sellings of weapons and so on. And this poor professional athlete being held as a hostage in Russia, basically being a civilian caught up in geopolitics. It was good optics for the Biden administration to get her released, and not that expensive for it to let Viktor Bout go politically. He is not a major figure anymore. He is a spent force in the world of arms trafficking.
A spent force. I want to get back to that second point in a moment. But when you say it was a good deal, let's listen to what Joe Biden said. During the announcement, he made no mention of Bout himself, but he did mention Paul Whelan. He's the head of security for an auto parts manufacturer. He's also a U.S. citizen, a former Marine, who's serving 16 years in Russia for spying. He was arrested back in 2018.
She wrote to me back in July. She didn't ask for special treatment, even though we've been working on a release from the day one. She requested a simple quote, "Please don't forget about me and the other American detainees. Please do all you can to bring us home." We never forgot about Brittney. We've not forgotten about Paul Whelan, who's been unjustly detained in Russia for years.
Vivian Walt, there's been criticism that not everyone agrees with Borzu, that don't, particularly Republicans, saying that this was not a fair trade and that Paul Whelan should have been in the mix.
Well, I think that Biden obviously thought so as well, but Russia clearly dug its heels in and simply wouldn't budge, and put the U.S. in a kind of position where they had to get her out. There was all the expectations that a deal had to be made before Christmas. And my own feeling is, Borzu put it quite well, that she was a hostage. She was not a prisoner. She was certainly not a criminal. She was a hostage. And it seemed very orchestrated from the moment that she was arrested. They needed to arrest somebody that they could trade. And it took nearly 10 months. But I think that from the moment she was arrested, this is what the Kremlin had in mind, and I think it pulled it off really effectively.
Joseph de Weck?
Well, what worries me a bit about this deal is exactly that the American part of the exchange was a hostage. So it was a person that was just arrested on bogus charges, And we have to think what this sort of deal means for the future. Does it mean that Russia slowly starts getting into the business of just randomly, arresting Americans who happen to travel in Russia in order to extract concessions from the US? There is this idea basically that you shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. A lot of countries do this. They say we don't do this because once we start making these deals, it will never stop. And to some extent, you can ask the same question about this deal as well. Russia as a state, it's not a terrorist organization. It's not, some terrorist group in Mali or somewhere else. But there is clearly a deal that is being done here, and there's a business that potentially has a future, and that is sort of the downside to this deal to some extent, which is worrying.
Nico Heinz?
Yeah, I think this question about not negotiating with terrorists is interesting. I don't think there are very many countries that really don't negotiate at all with terrorists. When it comes down to it, there's all sorts of people suddenly get released, and then it comes out years later that actually the US president did make a call, or that the British government was involved in behind-the-scenes negotiations. So I think the claim is much easier to make than the reality. You could hardly have left Brittney Griner in prison for years of her life just to kind of prove a point of principle. I think it's very interesting to see Vladimir Putin's thinking in all of this. In terms of trying to get Whelan released as well, the price that the Russians asked reportedly was for this guy who's been jailed in Berlin for murdering a Chechen fighter. They wanted him released, and he's only been in jail for a relatively short time for an extremely serious offence. It does paint a very strange picture that Putin is willing to stand up for these obvious bad guys, the merchant of death and an assassin. He is willing to go out of his way to strike a deal on the global stage. I think it tells us a lot about how little Putin is now paying attention to how people around the world see him, and that is a slightly frightening thought.
Yeah, and if viewers haven't read the book, The Merchant of Death, or seen the Hollywood movie where Viktor Bout is played by Nicolas Cage, it's certainly a larger-than-life character that today walks free. Viktor Bout, back in 2010, our own Cyril Payen spoke with him after his arrest. It was in Bangkok, Thailand, in a U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency sting operation. The Tashkent-born weapons trader who answered our reporter in French.
Listen, Americans with all their means and money never managed to show any evidence in 12 months. Until now, they've done nothing.
Payen telling us that he was convinced at the time that he would never be extradited and he wouldn't serve time.
I know this kind of swagger and confidence, which actually you caught a glimpse of when he was getting on the plane today back to Moscow, that he sort of came out looking pretty darn good.
So do you agree when Borzuz calls him a spent force, that he's yesterday's news?
Well, we have yet to really understand the kind of role he played within the intelligence services of Russia, which he certainly had deep connections to and involvement with. But we don't quite know whether he is simply, as in retirement at this point, or whether he has something to offer.
I mean, it's been 14 years. His face is known. His name is known. That's what I mean, that he's not a good operative anymore. His cover is blown, so to speak. If he was an intelligence operative, if he had a role in the intelligence services, it's not going to do Russia or anyone else much good anymore.
It's a public relations win. He's been interviewed already.
Sure. Yeah, it's a little political win for Putin in a very dark time where he's doing poorly in Ukraine.
All right. When we were talking about Viktor Bout, of course, It's happening in the context of a war, a Cold War of a different sorts. Dinner by candlelight is always romantic. But as we can show you in this Kyiv restaurant, it's by necessity repeated strikes by the Russians hitting critical infrastructure at the outset of winter. There have been rolling power outages in the newly retaken southern Ukrainian city of Kherson. The prospect of a freezing winter is a daunting one. Sympathy from the Kremlin, though, seems in short supply.
There is a lot of noise now about our strikes on the energy infrastructure of the neighboring country. Yes, we are doing it. But who started it? Who struck the Crimean Bridge?
Now, Nico Heinz, the Daily Beast wrote about Vladimir Putin's remarks earlier this week. At the same time, he's sort of hinting this Friday that there will have to be discussions at some point.
Yeah, although I can't believe he's actually said who started it. I mean, we all know who started it, and it was Vladimir Putin against the advice of even his own advisors, against the advice of any sentient human being in Europe, and he went ahead and did it. I think one of the interesting aspects to this war over the cold is what's also happening back in Russia. We ran a great piece by our Moscow correspondent Anna Nemtsova last week about how Russians are starting to freeze to death as the winter kicks in this year. It's something that happens every year in Russia, but particularly when poverty is at its height. And it's been made much worse this year by the fact that in many rural areas, villages, the men who go out to work have been taken away and sent to Ukraine to fight, while the rich sons of the Kremlin and the elites in Moscow have largely been left alone. The strong, fit, economically viable men in rural Russia have been sent to Ukraine, leaving behind families who are unable to fend for themselves. And over the next few months, there's going to be thousands of Russians dying in the cold, as well as thousands of Ukrainians dying in the cold.
Mm-hmm. Thousands of Russians, thousands of Ukrainians. Viv, Time magazine putting Ukraine's president on its cover this week. Volodymyr Zelensky, Person of the Year. And the nod comes with the challenges aforementioned.
Absolutely. And I mean, not just because I work for Time, but honestly, if anybody has not read it, you really should read it. It's written by the correspondent who knows Zelensky well and has been pretty much embedded inside the presidential compound for much of the war. So, one interesting thing about these strikes on the electricity, water, the infrastructure, is that the Russians seem to be striking very, very precisely. These have been really kind of impressive militarily, and they are working off maps from the Soviet Union, because all of Ukraine is still, of course, running on Soviet infrastructure from, 30 years ago. So I think it's really worrying, but it's also in some ways a sign of Putin's desperation. He's losing on the front line, and this is now the most devastating weapon that he has.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians claiming to have intercepted more and more. The other day there were 70 missiles fired and 60 of them intercepted, says Kyiv. And Vladimir Putin, who will or will not have to deal with dwindling revenue. It was the week where the European Union slapped a ban on Russian imports of seaborne crude. Soon after, well, it was time for traffic problems in the Black Sea. Turkey enforcing new rules to check the paperwork on tankers. They insist they don't want to fall foul of G7 nations that sanction those that cannot prove that the Russians aren't selling their oil at or below the $60 a barrel threshold that's been imposed. The problem, almost all the tankers you see in these images are carrying Kazakh crude, not Russian. As of Friday morning, the backlog was up to 28 tankers. Insurers accuse Ankara of overzealousness. while the West accusing him of overzealousness, stating this is the international group that represents insurers, representing 13 of them, saying on Monday that the Turkish request went well beyond the general information normally required. Josef de Vec, is Turkey keen not to fall foul of the U.S. Treasury, or is it cozying up to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think Burzu is probably the better person to answer this question, since he knows Turkey and Istanbul much better. I think the key point here is just that energy and the winter was supposed to be the biggest ally of Russia in this war. And I think what we're seeing now, we're seeing it in Ukraine, but we're also seeing in the rest of Europe that it doesn't really work, that Europeans aren't freezing too cold, that if you look at sort of levels of public support in Europe for the war or for supporting Ukraine, it's quite stable. And we're not seeing any collapse in sort of morale in Ukraine either. And in a sense, this can't really change in a long future as well, because even if you're in a situation where you imagine having an armistice being negotiated, there is not a huge upside, for example, for energy imports to Europe that is going to come.
There was this statistic put out by the French energy provider this week that the French had heeded the call and reduced their energy consumption by 10% over November of last year during the past month.
Yeah, I mean, the French have reduced electricity consumption by 10%. The Germans have also reduced by 10%. So that's more or less in the European line. And the thing is really that even if the war would stop, it doesn't mean that Russian gas would continue to flow or restart flowing to Europe the next day. Not at all. So in a sense, we're already in there, and we have to live with this world without Russian energy. Putin has fired his bullet, and now it's done.
How about Turkey? Can Turkey live without Russian energy?
I mean, no, it can't, and it needs it. It needs Russian energy, and it is the dependence on cheap Russian energy that President Recep Tayyip Erdogan very much hopes will keep Turks happy enough to give him another election win come June. When you're talking about Turkey these days and Turkish decisions and Turkish decision making, all that matters is one thing and one thing only: June 23rd, the date of those general elections.
Okay, so put that in perspective for us. What is it about double checking the paperwork on these tankers?
Turkey's trying to make itself relevant. Turkey is frustrated right now because of its inability to get the green light from the United States, Russia, any other player in Syria to launch its Syria invasion. It's wanted for weeks and weeks and weeks to take over Kurdish parts of Syria as a kind of election strategy to some extent, to show the Turkish people that Erdogan has a solution for the migrant crisis and so on. And Turkey has not been able to do that. And it's basically becoming difficult, and it's creating difficulties for everyone. I'm not sure how this even helps Russia at this point, given what my colleague over there was saying about the futility of Russian efforts at this point to make its energy relevant and its energy weapon relevant.
Yeah, this bottleneck is happening in the Black Sea, Nico Hines. It would be a bigger deal, except right now, the price of oil the last few days has gone down. This be over worries that China's economy may be subject to a wave of Omicron.
Yeah, I mean, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position if your entire plan is based on a certain price of any commodity, but of oil, of gas, because it's so hard to predict the way these things are going to move and change. China's economy is going to be impacted massively over the next year because they basically haven't had COVID over there yet. They've kept it locked down so tightly that it hasn't spread very much. They're about to start opening up, and there's going to be a huge wave on a basically unvaccinated population over the age of 65. And there's going to be massive ramifications for the global economy. And I think what we're seeing is Putin's fallback plan of, I can make people do whatever I want because I've got this gas, I've got this oil, is true to some extent, and that's why he's got lots of people who are afraid of upsetting him. That's partly why the Turks, don't want to fall foul of him. And there's lots of other countries, even including Germany and Italy, who've not been as hard on him as they might have been if they weren't partially reliant on the products that come out of Russia. But what he's done, if you look at it slightly longer term, is hasten Europe's decision to make sure it no longer does rely on these Russian gas and oil production. And that's going to mean that Russia's place on Earth, Russia's place in Europe is going to massively dwindle over the next 5 to 10 years as countries realize that this is not a reliable partner and that they'll find alternative plans.
Yeah, and one final word. We spoke of China. While the West scrambles to cut Russia's revenues, the Saudis making new friends, with Xi Jinping enjoying this Friday a double header of summits, first with Gulf states and then with Arab League nations. China's president with warm words for his host.
China is willing to move forward together with Saudi Arabia in realizing national revitalization and in promoting greater development of the China-Saudi Arabia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership.
Is that conversation something to worry Europe, or we don't care right now at this point? In terms of when you hear Josef talking about energy saving, when you talk about the faster move to renewables?
I think that you have to worry. I mean, Saudi Arabia is still the power within OPEC Plus, as it's known if you bring in Russia. But certainly it is still a massively important oil power. And one could argue becoming more important because of Russia's marginalization in the oil world. So the fact that they are making this kind of deal, which includes an enormous amount of, if you read the document, includes all sorts of different economic and political and ties, development ties, and energy, of course, with the caveat that they will not interfere in each other's internal affairs. So no criticism of the protests in China over the COVID policy, no questioning Saudi Arabia over its human rights record. I think it's very significant. And it certainly is such a contrast from the kind of cordial reception that Biden got when he went earlier this year to Riyadh and effectively begged the Crown Prince not to cut oil production. And within days, of course, the Crown Prince did exactly that. And I think it was very much a statement this week that, we're not going to be, the U.S.'s best friend anymore.
And yet Riyadh and its ally, the UAE, which played mediator in that prisoner swap we talked about at the outset.
Right, exactly. And so, there is so much happening within the Gulf region, of course, in the context also of this being the middle of the World Cup in Qatar, and all these, hourly flights going in and out of Dubai and flights going in and out of Riyadh. So, yes, I mean, of course, suddenly the Gulf is looking like it can be kind of a geopolitical power lever, if you like, between the U.S. and China.
We have to stop thinking of these countries as partners or allies or enemies and so on, and just grow up a little bit and just look at their interests. I mean, Saudi Arabia does what it does because it's in its interest, and it's obviously there's some values involved there. It's clearly rankled by the way the kind of distance that the U.S. officials treat Saudi Arabia with, and to some extent European officials. Yes, we'll buy your oil and sell you weapons, but we don't want to touch you. We don't want to get near you. We don't want to be photographed with you. That's pretty much the attitude of the West towards these countries. So there is that element, but Saudi Arabia and UAE and Turkey and these countries, they do what's best for them based on their own internal calculations. They're not our friends. They're not our enemies. They're not. They're basically playing their own game.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. If you look at who's the biggest client of Saudi Saudi Arabia's oil exports, it's China. And, the customer is king, and China is the biggest customer and is going to be the even more important customer in the future. The US, since long now, is not a net oil importer anymore. Europe, if you think in a sort of 10, 20-year perspective, is going to import much less fossil fuels as well. So where is all the Saudi Arabian oil going to go? Even more to China. So obviously they're going towards their customer, towards China. But then again, I don't think we have to dramatize the situation too much in a sense. I think there's a limit to sort of the China-Saudi Arabia relationship, and that is sort of the political and the security dimension to it. Saudi Arabia's tie with the US rests on sort of the security partnership, lots of arms exports, and a sort of strong US position against Iran. This is not something that China can do or where China will replace the US. So Saudi Arabia is playing its interest, and looking where the economic future is. But probably also aware that its security future lies somewhere else.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia, one of those nations mentioned as being those fomenting the troubles, say Iranian authorities. They've had a protest movement, the biggest in decades, that's been going on since September. And the week began with the dashed hopes that there would be some kind of concessions in the face of that protest movement. But the regime instead doubled down with its first execution of a demonstrator. Here you see the bruised face of Mohsen Shakari in what activists call a forced confession. His victim, a Basiji militiaman, required 13 stitches for a knife stab. He was hanged this week, the first of many warned hardliners. And yet on Thursday evening, they came out once more. These are social media images from Tehran, people chanting, "I'll kill whoever killed my brother," and "Death to the dictator." What kind of a week was it for Iran, Borzadar Gahin?
I think it was a cold one in Tehran, from what I could see. It was a week of strikes, protests, and then this horror. This young man, 23 years old, executed in a move that was just so far beyond even the Iranian regime's very poor standards on human rights. He was hung to death on a specious charge that could at best be described as attempted murder. It was an outrage even by Iran's own terrible standards and rules and laws. This was not a capital offense. There was no appellate process. This was a true atrocity.
And it's the first of many to come. So no compromise at all.
I think they're trying to. I think they're desperate, and I think they're trying many different moves. They're testing trial balloons, like easing up on hijab. They're opening up dialogue with.
Are they easing up on hijab?
Yeah, they've definitely de facto since September 16th. They've stopped the harassment of the systematic harassment of women and young couples and poorly dressed people on the streets. There's no more of that going on since the uprising began. They've either decided that they're going to step back, or they've redirected those security forces towards suppressing the protesters. So they're trying various means to try to get the people to stop protesting, and that includes semi-offers of compromise, and that includes the threat now apparent that even if you just go out and protest, you could be put to death.
The British newspaper, the Guardian, Nico Hines, reporting that doctors are saying that authorities are shooting women in their private parts at demonstrations.
I mean, it's just horrifying. It's understandable in some ways to see the way the regime is now attempting to try and put a lid on this. They've gone to absolute plan Z, try and just scare the hell out of everybody. And I think, to some extent that might have some positive impact. Some people might be afraid to go out and to protest, but ultimately you're just doing even more to undermine the regime's authority, its legitimacy, and it's getting to the point now, and I think we're on the pathway towards this, where the regime simply does not have the legitimacy to rule over the people of Iran anymore. And it's not going to be a straightforward way to solve that, there's going to be huge amounts of blood spilled as we try and come to a resolution. But it doesn't seem as though the Iranian regime is going to go out quietly.
Vivian Wall?
You know, I really felt this week that the kind of back and forth, you had the prosecutor general come out saying that there was not going to be the enforcement of the hijab anymore, which, as Borju said, there hasn't really been in a couple of months. Then you had the police saying, no, that's not true. And then you had this horrific hanging. It appeared to me, from kind of as an outsider who doesn't follow Iran exceedingly closely day by day, that this was a government that was absolutely fractured, not knowing what to do, and with different factions, and a kind of tussle over which way they're going to go. And I think what Nico says is correct, that in the process of trying to sort that out and reestablish the authority, it is going to be a very ugly and dangerous time.
Are there different factions? Because the line we're hearing is that no, now it's just all hardliners.
It's hardliners and, psychotic hardliners, essentially. But, there are some conservatives who've been, who are against Raisi. They've been against Raisi from the beginning. They tend to be more military types. And they really blame him for having reinvigorated the morality patrols and causing this mess. Because for years and years, the morality police was kind of easing up on people. He was the one who started revamping and revitalizing the morality patrols. And a lot of people are angry at him over that. You had this week the spectacle of the mayor of Tehran, a hardliner, opening up a dialogue with students who came and spoke to him and addressed their concerns. It seemed like a sort of sincere dialogue. So yes, there's different factions within the hardline elite, and they are tussling with each other, and there is disagreement. You could see it in their own press.
In other news, on Wednesday, Peru's president tried to dissolve parliament and the judiciary and wound up out of office and behind bars. Pedro Castillo seemed to have forgotten to first seek the support of political allies, the army, or even the police. Yet, that was arguably the second most bungled coup attempt of the week. Meet, if you will, Heinrich XIII Prince Royce, a minor royal from Thuringia in eastern Germany. He was one of 25 nabbed in raids across the country, as well as in Italy and Austria. The far-right pro-Russian cabal wanted to topple the government and declare a new Reich in the mold of the one that ruled Germany up to World War I. Josef de Weck, your thoughts on a story that has people chuckling slightly in many quarters, except in Germany, where they're taking it very seriously?
Well, I don't think people in Germany are taking it serious in the sense that there was a real danger of a coup. That's not really the story. Germany has very strong democratic foundations. If there was a real coup attempt, there would be millions of people in the street the next day and shouting that down.
And also their system is sort of hardwired so that because you have a federal system, so that staging a coup requires huge logistics.
I think the story here is not that much the coup. I mean, it just shows how crazy they were, that they were thinking in these terms. But the real worry is that you have a real story of right-wing extremism and terrorism. So these people, these 20, 30 people coming together, it's impossible for them to stage a coup, but they can very much do terrorist attacks. And in reality, in Germany, we have a history over the last 10, 15, and even longer years of right-wing extremist terrorism. For example, burning refugee homes, violence against Germans of Jewish or Muslim faith. For example, a couple of years ago, a mayor was killed, who made a stance that it was important to support refugees after the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis. So it just shows that there is in Germany a real problem of far-right extremist terrorism, and that this problem is not solved at all.
Because this included, the group included what, active officers, included a magistrate?
Yeah, everything. And I mean, if you look in sort of the statements these people did over the last couple of years, you'll hear all these kinds of conspiracy theories about the Rothschild bankers and about the Freemasons. I mean, like, this is complete conspiracy theories. But the problem is that some of these people or that are in this clique have in the past committed, real crimes. And that is the thing that is worrying for the future. And that is why Germany is taking this very seriously.
Germany's taking it seriously. Nico Heinz, they're also a lot inspired by QAnon. Is there a January 6th effect here?
I'm sure that was a big rallying point for a lot of these groups all over the world. Obviously, ultimately, the January 6th insurrection didn't amount to very much, but if you think about it, they did storm the Capitol, they got inside, and I think it was a reminder that if you can just waltz into the seat of power by using, huge numbers, even in the most heavily armed country in the world, you could probably do it in your local country too. I think, there's a temptation to laugh at this attempt, but it seems as though we're still not quite sure in terms of how many weapons, what kind of, how well prepared they were militarily. But it seems as though weapons were found in at least 50 locations as the police have been raiding places. So this is a really serious threat. And I think it's a very fine line when it comes to terrorism between an idiot and an idiot who's blown some people up. I don't know if anyone's seen the film Four Lions. It's a kind of comedy masterpiece, very British sort of dark sense of humour, where these kind of idiots are training in the woods and on rubber dinghy rapids to prepare themselves for a terror attack that they can never manage to actually pull off. But there's a very fine line between those guys who ended up, one of them blows himself up in a field by mistake on his own, and someone who manages to blow themselves up and actually take out, maybe it's just a couple of families, maybe it's 100 people. So it's really, really dangerous. And if you look at the US with the mass shootings, all you need is one lunatic with a gun to cause an absolutely enormous amount of damage.
I feel like Borzo Daragahi, it's kind of, when we were talking about the Christchurch mass shooting, when we talked about other incidents around the globe, there is this tiny but very active ecosystem that's global when it comes to these fringe elements.
Absolutely, and these movements have become transnational. They are inspired, sadly, by this kind of right-wing extremism has become one of my country's greatest exports from the United States. The QAnon, the anti-COVID stuff, the January 6th lunacy. But look, they arrested 25 people, and more are under scrutiny. We're talking about a network of 21,000 people in this Reichsbürger movement. If you had taken out the word far-right extremism and put in jihadis, that's all we would be talking about right now. If Germany had just arrested a cell of 25 jihadis that was planning to storm the Reichstag in Berlin and take over the German government, there would be no other news right now. So, yes, we can laugh at these guys a bit. They were armed. They had military experience. One was a tank commander. One was a battalion commander in a parachute unit. One was a member of the special forces, numerous police officers, and that's just the people that they've gotten in this particular round. More are coming, the German prosecutor says.
Vivian Walt?
I think Borzo has it quite exactly right, that there has been a tendency in the last couple of days to just blow this off as some kind of weird fringe group. But that might be the way in which we see right-wing extremists, and in the US as well, in which, right-wing extremism was downplayed for years before the January 6th insurrection. So I think that, we're accustomed to overblowing every single statement and action of support for jihadist groups, and we are accustomed to underplaying right-wing extremism. And I think we just don't have the balance right.
Josef de Vec, is there another factor? And we've talked about China. We've talked about Russia. And a lot of people have linked actions of what's happened in the world in 2022 to the after effects of COVID. Is there also a COVID effect here? A lot of these fringe groups were the ones protesting loudly back in 2020 and 2021 in Germany against COVID measures being taken by authorities.
Yeah, I think you can say so. I mean, in Stendhal's famous novel on love, he talks about this concept of crystallization, when love, crystallizes in a moment. And you can say maybe COVID was a moment of crystallization for, far-right and conspiracy theorists from all different walks of life coming together and organizing themselves. And if you look at the German story, we're talking about January the 6th and now this coup attempt in Germany. But in reality, it's the other way around. It was a COVID rally in Germany that was pre-January the 6th that turned out then afterwards, at some point, this COVID rally started to attack the Reichstag, the German parliament in Berlin, and tried to enter it. It never really got that far because police was there and was preventing it. But in reality, the German COVID protest in Berlin tried to take over the Reichstag, and that was before January the 6th, right?
That was August 2020.
Yeah. So in a sense, maybe actually we're seeing here the copy of what was originally a German story. But I do think, yes, if you look at sort of this far-right extremist, club and everything, you see it's so disparate, it's so wide-ranging, and perhaps the thing that brought them together were these COVID protests.
COVID supercharged the far right, gave them new recruits, and allowed them to infiltrate these anti-vaccination protests. This is according to German authorities. There was a merging, essentially. Okay, COVID restrictions are over. A lot of people drifted away from the movement, from these far right movements, from these anti-COVID restriction movements. But the ones who remain are the real hardcore, the real dangerous ones.
Nico Hines, how much attention has there been on this story where you are?
I don't think it's been a huge story over here. I think it's true that the anti-COVID lockdown movement has been key in this. I think a lot of people, I think it's really important to remember what a bizarre and awful time we've all been through. And I can understand why unhinged people or people who are easily persuadable have been taken up into believing that we're in some sort of end times and that this is some sort of post-apocalyptic, awful nightmare. It does feel a bit like that. So I think that's the perfect breeding ground for these kind of groups. But like we've been saying, there's a long trail of this kind of behavior that goes on years and years and years, predates COVID, obviously. And there was the Reichstag attempted storming in 2020, but there was also the shooting of the shisha bar in Germany in 2020. 11 people were killed. That was carried out by a kind of crazed right-wing conspiracy theorist as well. This is not a problem that's going to go away easily, unfortunately.
We'll have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much, Nico Hines, for being with us from London. I want to thank as well Borsu Dargahi, Joseph De Vec, Vivian Walt. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.